Welcome to Feed Your Lion. I'm Dr. Jodelle Yount, and I'm here to aid you in the mastery of total health, spiritual, mental, emotional, physical, and financial. So prepare to have your wellness tank filled up with this podcast. All right, guys, so the third week of the month is a learning activity, okay? And since I do a lot of hormone replacements, we're going to do a lot on cycles and how they work. So I'm going to talk this week for a little bit on what a normal ovulation cycle looks like for a female, okay? Because there's a lot of complicated things that go on in the body to make sure that we're having a regular ovulation cycle. Now, this is going to look different in, premenstrual females or menopausal women. So this is in that time frame in between that we're going to be talking about. So, what is an age for a typical normal cycle? For girls, around 12 is a typical starting age for having menstruation. Now, what's happening is we're getting younger and younger with that age. It used to be closer to 12 and a half or 13, and now it's going down even a little younger than 12 as the average. And I think this is due to a lot of these hormone disruptors, endocrine disruptors we're seeing in foods and the environment. It's the same reason we're seeing a lot of testosterone going down in men. So there are some changes happening, but still around 12 is that average age, okay? 10 to 15 is the gap for that, all right? The first couple years of the cycle are going to be a little more irregular, okay? So when a girl at 12, 13 starts getting her menstrual cycle, it's going to be irregular for those first couple years, okay? That's normal. And you'll normally see the first period happen a couple years after they start getting breast development as well. So that's the normal way of the menstruation, okay? As far as menopause, the average age in the United States is 51 to 52 years old for when you go into menopause. Now, I tell women I'm seeing in my office, ask your mom what age they went into menopause, because girls typically tend to follow what their mother did. So, 45 to 55 is the actual range, okay? But again, average age 51 to 52 years old. It's considered very, abnormal to be under 40 and have menopause, okay? And then you can call it menopause for those who still have a uterus when you've had a full year of not bleeding. So that isn't like I've gone 3 months and then I have a period and then I go 5 months. No, you will see those irregular cycles when you get closer to menopause. It has to be a full year without bleeding to be considered in menopause, okay? Another thing I want to say, with the number of eggs, you have the same amount of eggs, you don't produce anymore, okay? So what you're born with, you're not making any more after that. And you start with, when you're actually born, for females, up to like 2 million eggs at birth, okay? When you get closer to your actual menstruation, you're going to have roughly 300,000 to 500,000 eggs, okay? But you only use, in an ovulating cycle, you're only going to use about 400 or 500 of those eggs. The rest just kind of go away on their own. They naturally break down, basically. So you get the same eggs that you start with at birth, okay? You don't make any more, okay? So when you get to menopause, they're used up. You're done, okay? So that's how that works. Now, let's get into the actual topic here. The hormone cycle. The menstrual cycle is normally 28 days in length, okay? It's a monthly hormonal cycle. Now that can vary a little bit, anywhere from 21 to 35 days, but 28 days is the average cycle length, okay? There's 4 main hormones that we're going to talk about that determine that cycle, okay? So there's estrogen, there's progesterone, there's follicle stimulating hormone, which I'm going to refer to as FSH, and then there's the luteinizing hormone, which I'm going to refer to as LH, okay? And these hormones all act on each other. They're all involved, and it's through this HPA axis. What does that mean? It's the hypothalamic pituitary axis, okay? HPA, and we're going to talk about how that works. But this system together regulates these 4 hormones, and that's what you get your cycle from, okay? Now, when Lainey uploads this lecture for us, I'm not going to do like a full lecture, but I am going to have her upload a couple graphics that I can take for free off of Google, okay? I'm going to have her upload a couple of these free graphics so you can see how these hormones fluctuate, because I'm going to refer to these graphics a couple times. So if you're just listening to this, you know, I'll try to make it clear speaking as well, but it'll really help if you can pull up those graphics to see what that looks like. So these hormones that I talked about, the FSH, LH, estrogen, and progesterone, they rise and fall at specific times and in predictable patterns throughout that 28-day menstrual cycle, okay? The first thing that happens is you get FSH, which is going to stimulate the follicles to produce more estrogen. And then estrogen, I'm doing a quick overview, but we'll go into this. Estrogen then, the increased estrogen causes an LH spike, which is where your ovulation occurs. And then progesterone takes over during the latter of the luteal half. Okay, so the first phase, there's two major halves. I shouldn't say that because the first phase is your menstruation, but there's 2 major halves to your 28-day cycle. Okay, the first one is the follicular phase. Okay, and the next one is the luteal phase. Okay, and that goes, the follicular phase goes from day 1 of bleeding through ovulation. The luteal phase at ovulation takes over until your next menstrual cycle. So it's divided into half, the follicular and the luteal phase. And again, graphically, you'll be able to see that, okay? What I want you to note there is what actually causes you to bleed is when both the progesterone and estrogen actually decrease, these low hormones, okay? That actually triggers you to start bleeding at the end of the cycle. And then the ovulation is actually caused from that LH spike. So we're going to go through each of these phases in a minute here. But I want to talk about, I told you about the HPA axis, or the hypothalamic pituitary ovarian axis, okay? The brain is the one that controls everything on these hormones and these cycles. It's a step-by-step process that happens. It's really cool, actually, how this whole thing works together. But your hypothalamus first releases this gonadotrophic releasing hormone, okay? Now, if you guys don't know what the hypothalamus is, it's pretty much the body's main center for homeostasis. And what do I mean by that? It acts to stabilize everything in your body. It's the bridge between your nervous system and your endocrine system, okay? It regulates everything from how thirsty you are to your body temperature, when you're hungry, your sleeping and wake cycles, even your emotional responses, okay? So it helps maintain that regular system throughout your body. And the hypothalamus is in control of what happens with the pituitary. That hypothalamus releases things that are going to tell your pituitary gland what to do. Okay, what's your pituitary gland? Your pituitary gland is a small pea-sized little gland at the back of your brain. Okay, they call it the master gland because it regulates so many things in the body. Growth, metabolism, reproduction, how much water you're keeping or releasing, your stress response. Okay, and again, that pituitary is told what to do by your hypothalamus. So you got your hypothalamus releasing, you know, the GnRH, okay, that we just said, and it'll go act and tell the pituitary what to release. Now, I'm not trying to go into too much detail about this. I know this is complicated, but I just want you to understand that these are cycles. So the pituitary gland has 2 lobes. It's got your anterior and your posterior lobe, okay, and that just tells what you're releasing from those. The FSH and the LH that we said were 2 of our big hormones, they are released from the anterior lobe of the pituitary. Other things that are released from there, growth hormone, your TSH, which is related to your thyroid, your adrenal ACTH, which affects your adrenal glands, prolactin, which stimulates breast production, so milk production. So there's a lot of important things there. And then you've got your posterior lobe that does different things. It's got oxytocin, your love hormone, and then the antidiuretic, which helps you with water balance. Okay, so a lot of important things that are released from there, but the FSH and LH specifically are released from the anterior lobe when they're acted on by the hypothalamus. Okay, And finally, you've got your third level. So we've got hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, and now we get down to the third level. What's the third level? That's your actual ovaries, okay? And they are what produces your estrogen and your progesterone. All right, and then these hormones actually have a really cool, they regulate the cycle by responding back to the hypothalamus. So, hey, we've got enough, okay? It's got a feedback loop. So that final part of the ovaries producing the estrogen and progesterone does a negative feedback to tell the hypothalamus, hey, we're good, okay? So that's the HPA axis, and that's how we get our whole menstruation and the whole cycle, the 28 days, okay? So what are the 4 phases that we go through with a regular menstrual cycle? Phase 1 is the actual menstrual phase. This is when we bleed. This is day 1, okay? Phase 2, remember we said the first part is the follicular phase? That's the follicular. That means the follicles that hold the egg are developing in that part. Phase 3 is the actual ovulation, which again, that'll be the LH surge we'll talk about in a minute. And finally, phase 4 is the luteal phase, okay? And each phase has a different hormone that's acting as primary, okay? So let's start with the first one. What is the menstrual phase? What do we have when we're bleeding? We're basically shedding the uterine lining, okay? So when those hormones, estrogen and progesterone, drop off, it signals this bleeding to start. It signals us to shed that lining, okay? And that's if you don't get pregnant during that time before, okay? So both estrogen and progesterone are low, okay? The body then resets. This is like a reset time. That's what it's doing when you're bleeding. You're resetting, okay? And day 1 of bleeding in a clinical way, that's day 1 of your cycle. So that's important to know. Day 1 of bleeding equals day 1 of your cycle. Next, we're going into this follicular phase. Main hormones involved in this are FSH and estrogen. FSH, it's basically stimulating those ovarian follicles. Now, remember I told you, when you start menstruation, you have roughly 300 to 500,000, but we're only using in an ovulation cycle 400 or 500 of those total in our lifetimes, right? So, it's stimulating those follicles to start getting ready, okay? Each follicle has an immature egg in it, so the follicles actually hold your eggs. And during the course of this time, one follicle becomes more dominant than the rest, okay? This follicle then starts producing estrogen. Estrogen, okay, FSH stimulates follicles. You get a dominant one, and that dominant follicle starts producing more estrogen. What does estrogen do? Estrogen is considered the builder, okay? It thickens that endometrium, which is the lining of the uterus there. It's thickening that because it's preparing for a possible pregnancy. So when the estrogen levels rise, you get a thicker endometrium. It also triggers the ovulation. What do I mean by that? Remember I told you estrogen acts back on the hypothalamus. Well, normally, as estrogen gets a little higher, you're going to actually have a negative feedback on that. But with this part of the cycle specifically, you get super high levels of estrogen. And that actually causes the release of LH, which then causes the ovulation. So it is the signal when your estrogen gets that high, it stimulates those that LH release. And that's your next part is the ovulation. So by the end of this phase, your estrogen levels, again, are high because the FSH is stimulating the follicles, and that main follicle is producing a lot of estrogen. All right, so we got FSH. We're calling that the initiator because it initiates the follicles to develop, and then estrogen. Estrogen, we're calling it the builder, okay? It also helps, just as a side note for estrogen, there's a lot of feel-good hormones with estrogen, a lot of good moods. It's good for your brain, bone, skin, your heart. So there's a lot of other things that it does in the body besides just the menstrual cycle. But I'm focusing specifically on the role in a normal cycle today. We are going to dive into other parts of estrogen specifically or progesterone specifically. But today I'm focusing on how this affects your normal cycle so you can have a baseline going forward. All right. Now we're into that positive feedback in the LH search. So remember what I said. Normally, estrogen, if it's high, it's going to give negative feedback to say, hey, we've got enough. Okay, it's talking to the hypothalamus, which talks to the pituitary, which talks to the ovaries, right? 1, 2, 3. And then it goes back up, tells it no. But when you get that super high estrogen level there, it's going to give a positive feedback, which causes that big spike in the LH. LH is our trigger, right? That says, hey, we're going to release now. That sudden surge of LH that happens, it triggers the ovulation. That means that dominant follicle is going to break out the egg, okay? The egg is released, okay? That's ovulation, okay? And then when the egg is released, what you have left over is called the corpus luteum. I know they have all these funny names for that. But the corpus luteum is that follicle that's already ruptured the egg, okay? And that corpus luteum then starts secreting a lot of progesterone. So now you see we're moving after ovulation into this corpus luteum phase, where this leftover follicle, after the egg has gone away out of it, it starts producing a lot of progesterone. All right, so let's go into what progesterone is doing. And by the way, that egg that has been released during ovulation, it's usually surviving about a day, okay? Usually about 24 hours out there. Excuse me. We say a fertile window is about 5 days, okay? So you usually have around that ovulation time about a 5-day window when you can possibly get pregnant for a regular ovulation cycle, okay? Now, I want to digress for a minute. You can have anovulation cycles. The egg means none, okay, in front of it. So you can have a regular menstruating woman who doesn't every single month release an egg that can be fertilized. It's normal to have a little bit of this, okay? There's a lot of different things that play into this. Like I said, a regular anovulatory cycle at times is common, okay? But there are several things that can cause women to have more difficulty getting pregnant or more anovulatory cycles, okay? And that could be a whole nother lecture, but things like PCOS, which is very common. The follicles have a hard time maturing, and you see them on the outside, like that's why people get the ovarian cysts. These are these immature follicles, okay? So that's a really common one you see, and they have a harder time getting pregnant. Excessive stress and lifestyle factors that can affect your estrogen levels. Weight, so fat, estrogen stored in fat. So really a lot of weight loss or really thin, they can have a lot of problems like generating this proper hormone cycle, and they can have a lot more anovulatory cycles. So there's a lot of things there that can cause, and then of course, like I said, when they're first starting out into adolescence and periods, or towards the end when they're in that perimenopause time, you can have more of these anovulatory cycles. So there's a lot of factors. What I'm giving you now is what a typical menstrual cycle will look like, but you can have these times that are normal too, to have a few where you're not actually letting an egg release. But typically, you know, if you're releasing an egg, you got about 24 hours typically with that egg floating around there waiting for its sperm, or you have, you know, 5-day typical fertile period that we say that there's a possibility of that. And also a couple other things that happen to like support this. Your cervical mucus layer actually gets thinner, and again, that's to allow more sperm through to survive, because normally when you have thicker cervical mucus, the sperm can't get through. So that also happens. And then your temperature, your basal temperature, internal temperature also rises a little bit during this time. So there's a bunch of things that can happen to help support this. So that's your ovulation. So now, like I said, we move into the luteal phase. Progesterone is our dominant hormone here. And again, that follicle, it's let go of its egg. The corpus luteum is left, and that starts producing a lot of progesterone. Progesterone, we call it the maintainer, right? It calms things down. And what it does with that endometrium, we said the estrogen thickened it up. The progesterone is really preparing the uterus for pregnancy with that. It transforms that uterine lining and makes it more easy for the fertilized egg to implant. So it's preparing that, okay? And if you do get fertilization or pregnancy during that time, the progesterone levels will continue to remain at a higher level to support that new pregnancy there. It also suppresses further follicle stimulation because at that time you don't need that. So it's suppressing FSH and LH. Remember, you know, with the estrogen rise, we had that LH boom. It's kind of suppressing it after we've gotten past that ovulation time. So it's considered to have more of a soothing effect on the mind and body. It impacts like things like sleep. So, you know, when I'm doing hormone replacement, anybody who's got a uterus and they're on estrogen, I'm giving them progesterone too. And then we always say, you know, you want to take this at night after you've had dinner because progesterone has that soothing, calming effect, and it really like helps people sleep. So that's kind of the role of progesterone. You're preparing the body for, or preparing the uterine lining for pregnancy. If there is a fertilized egg, it's really staying elevated for a while, okay? So that's the luteal phase. Those are days, usually ovulation, I should have said that's around day 14, okay? And then the luteal phase is typically from 15 to 28, so that's through the end of the cycle there. What happens if pregnancy doesn't occur? That corpus luteum that's secreting that progesterone, it degenerates. So the hormones, that's when the hormones drop. The progesterone drops, the estrogen drops, and that drop in hormones triggers menstruation, and then we're back to day 1. So day 1, you know, is menstruation. That's usually days 1 through 5 typically. And then follicular phase, you know, includes that menstruation, the 1 through 5, and goes up to day 13. Usually around day 14 is ovulation, and then through the end, the 15 to 28 is the luteal phase, okay? And then the cycle begins again, basically, if there's no pregnancy at that time. So, couple questions. Why do we tend to feel worse at certain times? And specifically, you hear a lot of people say, you know, the first couple, or like right before their cycle and the first couple days of their cycle, why do we feel bad during those times? Well, there's a few reasons, okay? First of all, what do we say triggers bleeding? Both the estrogen and the progesterones are dropping. It's a rapid hormonal decrease. So estrogen, you know, you've got depression, anxiety, and fatigue when that drops. Progesterone, you can get restless sleep and exhaustion. If you've got, like I told you, it can help you sleep and stuff, but if you have a sudden drop like what we see with the cycle, it can cause the like restless sleep and the exhausted feeling that you get. Also, serotonin and estrogen gives the brain serotonin a boost. So what's serotonin? It's our feel-good neurotransmitter in our brain, right? It regulates mood, sleep, a lot of things. So when estrogen go down, so does your serotonin levels. So that can cause you to be irritable, can cause food cravings, low energy. Also, estrogen also affects the production of melatonin, which regulates your sleep, right? So not only are you having these drops in hormones, it also affects other things like these neurotransmitters and things like melatonin that also impact us. Remember, I told you after ovulation there, your basal temperature starts to go up a little bit. When your basal temperature, your internal temperature is going up, it's requiring a lot more energy as well. So this higher energy demands means the body's burning more calories to rest. That's another reason we tend to be more hungry right before our period. You have a higher temperature, you're burning through these calories, and it makes women feel tired, okay? So these are all, you have regular physical reasons why you're feeling this way. And then with the start of your period, you've got prostaglandins that are going off. That's causing the uterus to contract with menstruation, okay? It's causing us to bleed. That can cause nausea. It's an inflammatory thing, so it can cause the cramping, the nausea, even if you've heard the term period flu, where you feel like the low-grade fevers or body aches. Like I get that sometimes for my period, and you really feel like you're coming down with the flu for a minute and you know you're right about to start. Like that's all normal. Also, some women have a lot of heavy bleeding, and that can cause iron deficiency and anemia and that kind of thing. So all of these things can contribute to us feeling kind of bad, you know, right before our period or that first couple days. Things you can do to support that. Eating good. I know we crave like the chocolates and the salts and all the stuff, but eating really healthy whole foods like I'm always talking about can actually really help that. I mean, even like making sure you're getting plenty of protein and things like that, and iron in when you're, like if you're bleeding heavy, just to support that. But especially women with like the PMS or the PMDD, which are like they're really sensitive to those hormone changes. Eating right, getting good sleep, reducing stress, especially during those times like, you know, right before your period or the first couple days. You know, give yourself, you know, the time sometimes you need to recover and to acknowledge that, hey, these things are going on and I got to take into account. So I just wanted to mention that. And so I want to summarize. I mean, this kind of gives you an overview. Like I said, we're going to be doing a lot more lectures based on things like, I'll probably do one on menopause. I'll probably talk about some of the common things like PCOS. Thyroid dysfunction can affect a lot of these things too. So I'll do different little mini lectures like this on the third week of the month. But just a summary for today, I wanted to talk about normal cycles for ovulation. And again, we talked about some of the things, but so what happens? The first thing, the FSH rises, that stimulates those follicles, right? Okay. The follicle, the dominant one that's going to have the egg on that one, okay? The FSH will stimulate the estrogen release. So you'll start getting a lot of estrogen. It'll rising, that endometrium will thicken. It'll provide that normally negative feedback, but when it gets really high, we're getting a positive feedback to get an LH spike. And that causes you to ovulate, right? That main dominant follicle releases its egg. And then you've got the corpus luteum left over. And that starts producing the progesterone, so you can stabilize the uterine lining and support pregnancy if it's there. If there's no fertilization that occurs during that time, then that corpus luteum degenerates, the progesterone and estrogen drop off, and you get menstruation, which starts the cycle all over again, okay? So all of these hormones coordinate for the function of the ovary, the release of the estrogen and the progesterone from the ovaries. And remember that the FSH and LH are coming from the pituitary, and then they act on the estrogen and progesterone from the ovaries. And then it affects the uterine lining, the thickness, and how stable it is. And of course, fertility timing. So that's kind of thing. Normal 28-day cycle, you're typically starting at around 12 and ending around 51 or 52 in the US is typical. And remember, you're only going to use about 400 to 500 eggs in your entire lifetime, even though you start at birth with anywhere from 1 to 2 million typically. So there's a lot of eggs you start with, and by menopause you've kind of lost them all. So but that's really it. I hope you guys learned something, and like I said, we'll attach a couple free graphics so you can kind of see how that cycle works. Thanks again.